right, so welcome everybody, and we are finishing up the semester. We covered Unit 4 already. We kind of went back to do Unit 3. These aren't sequential, they actually are things going on at the same time. They all fall within 1450 to 1750. So Unit 4 dealt with the sea-based or maritime empires and new empires that were built in the New World by the Spanish and the Portuguese and so forth. And these are now in Unit 3, we're talking about land-based empires. There are only 3 topics: how these empires administrated themselves. That means, how did they rule? How were they able to organize control over such a large, expansive area? Also, another topic is how they expanded, and another topic is how they used belief systems. Those are very important for all of these older empires. So you have a video on the Ottomans already, you have a reading on the Ottomans, and I'm going to talk about the Russians today. So I'm going to share my screen out here, and we're going to deal with the Russian Empire. To begin our look at Russian history and the rise of the Russian Empire, we need to keep in mind that it was part of the Mongol Empire. So if you remember the period 1200 to 1450, the Mongols come along, they create the largest land-based empire in history, and they conquer all these areas. They conquer Song China, and really the story of China in this time period is them emerging from Mongol rule and establishing their own rule, and it's the same with Russia. Now, back in the previous time period, Genghis Khan, who built this massive empire you see here, he died, and his grandsons took over and split it up into the various colored regions that you see here. And it's the orange region that's going to occupy our discussion this morning. That was the part, it was called the Golden Horde, and that was one Mongol Khanate that ruled Russia. And the way they ruled Russia is they took it over, and then they backed off and just demanded that tribute be paid. Tribute was collected at a town that was most accommodating to Mongol rule. It was not very rebellious, and they seemed to go along with what the Mongols wanted, and this was Moscow. So this actually created the importance of Moscow in Russian history. So the Mongols would go to Moscow and collect the tribute once a year. Now, to make a long story short, when we get close to this time period, right before 1450, the Russian princes of Moscow and the aristocrats began to rebel against against Mongol rule, and they managed to liberate the city and then conquer areas around it, driving the Mongols out. It's important to know that Russia, before it was conquered by the Mongols, was kind of a spin-off of the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. It got its religion, Orthodox Christianity. It got its written language. All that came from Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. So that Christian heritage was very important. And it became extremely important when, number one, Constantinople fell to Muslims, and it made the Russian civilization feel like they kind of got, it's like their parents died. Now it's on us to represent the true form of Christianity. And the other thing is that the Mongols converted to Islam. So breaking free from Mongols now had this kind of crusading zeal to it. It was Christians against Muslims now. And the leader that really gave the first kind of formative identification to Russia during this time period, his name was Ivan III. And there are 2 things about Ivan III that you need to know. First of all, when Ivan led this rebellion and expanded Russia a little bit from Mongol rule, he married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. So when Constantinople fell, 1453, the Muslims came in, they massacred the city, they killed the emperor and most of his family, but his niece remained alive. Ivan III married her. This is his way of kind of connecting to that ruling family to claim that he's continuing that rule. Matter of fact, he will dub Moscow the Third Rome. All right, you had original Rome overrun by barbarians in 476. Then the center of Christian civilization moved to Constantinople. It was overrun by the Ottomans in 1453, and now it's up to Moscow. Rome version 3.0. So he referred to he referred to Moscow as the Third Rome. And it's not just about naming it. It's connecting to a tradition. He's branding his new state along Christian Roman lines. And not only that, he called himself the Russian word for Caesar, which is Tsar, C-Z-A-R, or sometimes T-S-A-R. And this becomes the name of Russian emperors from this point all the way up till the end of the imperial period. So Russian leaders are called czars after Caesar. And you have this idea of the Third Rome. And he marries his niece. And this gives this kind of crusading zeal. Now his son is Ivan IV. He comes down to us in history because of a very unfortunate translation of his title, Ivan Gronsky. He's, in English, that translates as Ivan the Terrible. And you might think he was terrible, but that's just, that's Gronsky. His last name, or this title, means awesome or full of power. But anyway, along comes Ivan IV. And Ivan IV is going to do some very important things. First of all, he's going to complete the liberation from the Mongols. He's going to march his soldiers to the capital of the Golden Horde, which is Kazan. He's going to lay siege to the city and defeat it. And he's going to do this he's going to lead his troops by telling them that they are marching as soldiers of Christ in this crusade against the Muslim Mongols. And by doing this, he expands Russian civilization, and Russia actually becomes a full-blown empire during the reign of Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible. He does something else. You need to know that all of these empires deal with the issue of the intermediaries that exist between the ruler and the ruled. How can one person, an emperor, rule such a massively diverse area before there's any type of media or television or any connectivity like we have today? Well, there has to be individuals that you trust and kind of this hierarchical pyramid-shaped chain of command from the very top to the very bottom. And all of these empires that we study kind of tweak this a little bit to make it work better. The easiest thing to do is use the wealthy aristocrats, the landowners that already live in these areas, as your tools of rule. But they tend to be independently minded and don't really carry out the will of the Tsar. And in Russia, these are called boyars. B-O-Y-A-R-S. Boyars are landowning, wealthy aristocratic families. And the problem that frustrates Ivan is that the boyars are too independent and don't really collect the taxes that he wants. They don't carry out his plans and his will. So what he does, Ivan creates a secret police force, kind of a terrorist group, and these are basically criminals and thugs, and he enlists them to go and basically kill boyar families that are resistant to his rule. And these uprachini, they're called, terrorize the land. They ride at night with their black capes and their severed dog head emblem embroidered on the front of their uniforms, and they basically just eliminate boyars that resist Ivan's rule. Some boyars are allowed to remain alive, but what Ivan does is he forces them to live far from their estates. So notice what that does. That incapacitates them. It makes it so they can't raise an army out of their serfs, and it cuts them off from the sources of wealth. So it basically renders them harmless. So this is how Ivan deals with the centralization of the state. He's going to bypass those boyars or those aristocrats that are too independently minded to really allow him to centralize the state. So this is Ivan. Now, the unfortunate thing about Ivan, and one reason he probably does deserve the title Terrible, is that he had this paranoia that people were always out to get him. He loved to kill and torture people who he thought were his enemies. And in a fit of rage, his only son got in an argument with the son in a monastery, and Ivan killed his son. He struck him on the head with a rod and killed his son. And this is a famous painting in Russian history where Ivan realizes what he's done. Not just that he murdered his son, but this is the end of the dynasty. There are no male heirs directly. He has no other sons, so this is the end of that. And we'll talk about what happened in just a second. I do want to mention that Ivan was certain to use art, just like we've seen, in the service of the state. Because what he did was when he returned from Kazan after defeating the Mongols, he built one of the most famous buildings in Russia, the most recognized buildings in Russia, St. Basil's Basilica, or St. Basil's Cathedral. And this is built right in front of the Kremlin, which is where the government is in Russia. This is in Red Square today. This is a church meant to memorialize a victory in military. You would think that perhaps a statue would do better, or a warrior on a horse, or a man with a sword, or like our memorials to war with soldiers pushing up a flag or something. This is a church. That shows you that this, what he thought was a gift to God, shows that he thought God had granted him victory over the Mongols, and he wanted to put that on public display. So this was meant to fuse together the Russian authority of the state and justify or legitimize it with Christianity, and that those things become inexorably fused together in Russian history. So what happens after Ivan murders his own son? Russia falls into a terrible time known as the Time of Troubles, a very appropriately named era where there's chaos, and this goes on for a while. But eventually the boyars kind of recover, the ones that survived, and the boyars decide that they need to end the Time of Troubles and just elect one family to be the ruling family and reestablish a ruling dynasty. So they chose a family called the Romanov family, a boyar family called the Romanovs. And the Romanovs are the last dynasty to rule in Russia. They will rule all the way to the communist period, where the last Romanov, Nicholas II, and all his family, his 5 children, his wife, were executed by the communists after the Russian Civil War. But that 300 years of Romanov rule begins here. So Russia has turned into an empire, not quite as big as you see in the map here, but you see Moscow over there on the left-hand side liberates an area, Novgorod, and it moves to the east above Perm. A little bit further than that is Kazan, and under the Ivans, that's where it goes. Now, I want to spend the rest of the time briefly talking about the most famous czar, really in Russian history, I think, one of the most formative czars, and this is a Romanov named Peter the Great. All right? So Peter the Great, he wasn't the first Romanov, but he was the czar's son, obviously, raised in Moscow with his siblings. He was a lot bigger, a lot taller than most people at the time, hence the word great. He was a pretty tall. This is the time when the average man was like 5 foot, 5 foot and a half, and Peter was something like 6'6". So he was a huge man. But as a young boy, Peter would go into the part of Moscow that was forbidden. It was an area called the German Quarter in the city. And the German Quarter is where all the foreigners had to stay when they visited. And you did have a lot of merchants coming to Russia for the fur trade and just to do business. And Russians kind of quarantined them in one area, foreign area of the city, which, because so many of them were German, was simply called the German Quarter. And as a boy, Peter went in there. And he got to know some of these people. He got to learn their language. And he kind of realized that they were talking about their civilizations, which he came to understand were much more advanced than Russia. And he was right. As a teenager, he went and visited the Netherlands and France and England, often disguising himself as a common worker, and even got a couple menial labor jobs, or manual labor jobs, in a metallurgy shop and in a shipbuilding yard in the Netherlands. And he loved to tell everybody when his time was over who he was, the next Tsar of Russia. But this is very important because his experience in Western Europe showed him all the advancements. Look, Russia was ruled by the Mongols for over a century. We started today talking about that. Many historians point out that because tribute was paid through the feudal system, with serfs to lords to, up to princes, that this froze Russia in a state of backwardness. It kept them in serfdom and in feudalism when Western Europe was going through the scientific revolution. Western Europe had the Renaissance. So all these changes and modern adaptations were going on in Western Europe. Russia was quarantined from that and missed out on it all. Peter the Great was the first person to realize how far behind Russia was. So he became the leader, and what he's going to do, he's going to launch an incredibly ambitious and radical period of reforms in Russia known as the Petrine Reforms, named after him, the Petrine Reforms. When I explain the different components of Peter the Great's reforms that just radically wake up Russia and try to bring it into modern times, think about how they fit into the topics of administration, the use of religion, and expansion, and so forth. So the first reform he's going to do is he's going to build up the Russian military. The old Russian armies, like what Ivan IV used, were serf armies a lot. He had seen firsthand the most advanced military in Western Europe, which was the French. And he's going to reform the military along French lines. The French divided their troops up into smaller groups and larger groups, like regiments and so forth. And even a lot of the names we have for military divisions in our own country come from the French, like corporals and sergeants, and those types of words are all French. So Peter the Great is going to reform the military and create a better organized, more efficient military based on the French model. He's also going to build a navy. The Russian Navy begins with Peter the Great. Remember, he worked in a shipbuilding yard, and he knew the benefits of having a powerful navy. Other thing, he's going to build up the infrastructure. That means building bridges and roads that facilitate trade, the movement of troops, and allow for taxation in remote regions. So infrastructure is always a very important part of a civilization. Secondly, he's going to take that new military and he's going to conquer area around it. Most famously, he's going to go to war against the King of Sweden, and I'll show you a map in just a second of area just to the north of Moscow that Peter the Great conquered from Sweden and today is a permanent part of Russia. He'll also expand eastward and take over and bring Siberia into the Russian stronghold. Siberia is not just a frozen tundra area of Russia, it's larger than the size of the United States. So he'll expand Russian territory immensely. Now, he's going to reorganize the bureaucracy and also taxation. So this requires just a little bit of explanation. And this fits right in to administration. I told you that all emperors have to deal with the intermediaries. They have to come up with a way of creating these human links that connect them and their rule right down to the local, provincial level. And the Chinese used bureaucrats who took a civil service test. We saw that at first Ivan the Terrible used the boyars and then he eliminated them. Peter the Great is going to redo the bureaucracy by creating something called the Table of Ranks. The Table of Ranks is a list of hierarchical positions. Think of today we have a president, then we have governors of states, then we have mayors of towns, and then we have town council members, so from the top to the bottom. But in our civilization, we vote for those. The Table of Ranks in Russia were all appointed. There were man-made positions that he came up with, that he appointed. So it wasn't based on hereditary. If you were way up in the bureaucracy and your father was way up in the bureaucracy, you didn't inherit that. Every position was earned. It had nothing to do with your wealth, or it had nothing to do with your lineage or your family's name. Peter the Great could appoint you, but he could also take you out. That meant it was obedience and loyalty that placed somebody in the bureaucracy of Peter's Russia. So you have this incredibly, you had to be loyal to Peter, otherwise you would lose this position. And remember, these positions pay very well and they give you power over areas. So that's how he reformed the bureaucracy. He created the Table of Ranks. Also, he reformed the way that Russia taxed. And this sounds really boring, but it's kind of interesting. Old Russia taxed by household. So every household paid a tax. Now, what peasants did, they found loopholes to get around this. If a peasant son married to another family, that family would just stay registered to a single household, so you would have multiple families registered at a single household. The taxes per household, that means the amount that each family paid was much less because they were divided by the number of households. So peasants would register multiple families
at a single household and split the tax that they were all supposed to pay individually and pay it by individual family, meaning they paid a lot less. Peter knew this was costing enormous amounts of revenue, of potentially a potential lost revenue. So he redid the taxation system where now in villages it was a per person tax. And this, of course, angered peasants. This loophole had been shut, but now every person has to pay a tax. Every adult has to pay a tax, just individually. And it's interesting that you might say, well, how do they know how many people there were? The Russian government worked very closely with the Russian Orthodox Church because every person born in Russia was baptized as a child, so the baptismal records were in the church, and when they died, it was registered in the church. Every birth, death, and marriage was registered with the church, so the church colluded with the government so the government could more accurately tax things. And by the way, that's going to bring in enormous amounts of revenue. That's really what funds this military reform, this new infrastructure, the wars against Sweden, and building the bridges and roads, all that is done through this reorganization of the tax system. So this is another legacy of Peter and how he administered his rule. Another problem he had is that Moscow was so interwoven with old Russian culture and old interests, and he wanted to start fresh. So Peter the Great rode with his men to the northern part of Russian territory and land that had just been conquered from Sweden. He found a spot on the banks of the Neva River, and he said, I want a city right here. And he commissioned the building of a city specifically to be his capital. And this has only happened a few times in history. Usually a capital is just made and that designation is brought to a city that already exists. But this city was built specifically to be a capital. And Brazil has another similar situation if you took AP Human. And also Washington, D.C. was built just to be a capital. So what Peter the Great did, he outlawed contracting, building contracting. He outlawed masonry, concrete work, stone cutting, carpentry in every place in Russia except where he wants that city. So it drew all these people who wanted employment to come to this wilderness and build a city. And he named the city after a saint in the Bible, one of Jesus' disciples, that also happened to bear his name. So ostensibly it was named after Peter the Apostle, but the name of the city is St. Petersburg. And it's one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. So he relocated the capital, and this cut him from all those vested interests and conservative forces that were kind of putting a limit on his rule there. It's also interesting that Peter wanted to cut educated Russians off from their own culture and kind of graft Western European culture onto Russia. He felt that Russia was so far behind. And one of those things he did most famously is in Western Europe, beards were out. They weren't in fashion. You go to Russia, and it's like in Orthodox Christianity, the bigger your beard, the more holy you were thought to be or something. So Peter the Great outlawed beards. He made people wear clothes that looked not like Russian, but like Western Europeans. Here's a famous picture from Russian history of a boyar who refused to cut his beard. Peter would invite them to the capital where he would personally cut their beards off. You see, he's wearing, I don't know why he looks so kind of small and squirrely here, but that's him on the right. And he's holding the scissors, wearing European-looking hat and clothes. And the boyar is wearing the traditional Russian boots and cape, things that Peter hated. Interestingly, this kind of creates an identity crisis for Russians about what exactly they are, what their identity is. Russia is a mixture of its indigenous Muscovite culture, and from the time of Peter the Great, there's this kind of artificial grafting of French and English culture on top of that, which caused some resentment and made other people feel like Russia's finally catching up. But nevertheless, you see things like the Petrine reforms across Russian history, where Russia feels like it's way behind and has to take some great leap to catch up. with everybody else. Stalin will do this in the 20th century, and we'll see that later. So these are the Petrin reforms, what he does to rule the state, and how he reforms the taxation, the bureaucracy. This is St. Petersburg, by the way. Notice it doesn't look Russian. It doesn't look like those onion domes we saw on St. Basil's. Matter of fact, these buildings, and this was later embellished by Catherine the Great, but she too wanted to bring in European influence. This looks much more French and Italian Renaissance, as does this in St. Petersburg. This looks like it could be St. Marco's Plaza in Venice. You see the dome in the back, the colonnades around. This has nothing to do with Russian civilization. This is a copy of Italian architecture. And so you had St. Petersburg. Catherine called it the window to the West. It was like a mirror that reflected Western European culture. So here you have the Russian Empire. If you see Moscow over there, right here, St. Petersburg is right up here in land taken from the Kingdom of Sweden. Look how far north that is. And by building that capital city there, in this strategic location, it would prevent Sweden from really ever taking this land back. And there was a very famous siege of that city in World War II. The communists would rename it Leningrad, but anyway, that's for later. Here's Kazan. That's the city that Ivan IV sieged and took over, defeating the Golden Horde, came back to Moscow and built St. Basil's. This is Siberia. Peter the Great conquered a lot of Siberia, and you have this this eastern expansion right on top of the Qing dynasty in China. And Peter the Great gave free seeds and free tools and money to Russians who would go out there and settle. He's trying to seed this new land with Russian people and Russian civilization. And it goes with, it's interesting to note that a few centuries later, the United States will do the same thing. After the Louisiana Purchase, they'll give land to white settlers of European descent who move out and claim land that at that time was occupied by Native Americans. You have the same thing with the Homestead Act that the United States did. Give incentives for people who are like you to settle in newly acquired territory to try to change its culture into something different. So this is Russian westward expansion. This is Siberia, by the way. Note that Siberia isn't just the frozen tundra that you think it is. It's rich. The amount of money that came into Russia through the fur trade was enormous. All right, I want to conclude by talking about Russian art, because Russians too used art to legitimize their rule. This is a picture called Our Lady of Vladimir, and the subtitle is The Genealogy of the Russian State. And look at this. There's the Virgin Mary with Jesus in the middle. That motif in art is called the Madonna. And notice that this is a tree. It's growing from the bottom, and the branches have these circles with little portraits of famous people, patriarchs in Russian Orthodox religion, and political leaders, all growing from the same tree. And I'm going to show you a detail of the top of this picture. At the top, you see the risen Christ in heaven, in the clouds, looking down in approval of this genealogy of the Russian state. You know, genealogy meaning the ancestry. Where did the Russian state come from? And the angels are serving there, but you can see some of the pictures there of important saints and important politicians. Now, more interesting, I'm going to look at the bottom of the painting here for just a second. Notice that the tree is growing out of a church. And where is that church? Behind that red wall. That is called the Kremlin. This is the Kremlin church inside the capital, the very place where the government is seated in Moscow. So, and by the way, the capital would move back to Moscow. So the genealogy of the Russian state is a piece of art that's meant to re-emphasize the Russian idea that Christianity and the legitimacy of the state are combined. They're inexorably connected together. This goes back to Ivan III marrying the niece of the last Byzantine Empire, calling himself the Tsar. Ivan IV marching his soldiers as they are warriors of Christ and a crusade against Kazan, and the artwork that came during the time of Peter the Great that fused together religion in service of showing that the state was legitimate and deserved your obedience. So this is some basic outline and structure of the Russian state. So anyway, I think that's off now, and that's a good little summary there. By the way, there is more reading in its learning on the Russian state. We'll fill some of that in, and also we need to catch up on Qing China. There's reading on the Manchus for Qing China in there, and its learning as well. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys later.